Well, good afternoon, my lords. If there's a division in the chamber whilst we're sitting, this committee will adjourn as soon as the division bells are rung and resume after 10 minutes. Building Safety Levy England Regulations 2025, Baroness Taylor of Stevenage.
My Lords, I beg to move that the committee consider the draft Building Safety Levy England Regulations 2025. These regulations were laid before the House on the 10th of July 2025. The Government is committed to the remediation of residential buildings with unsafe cladding in England. Our remediation acceleration plan sets out how we will remove barriers so that buildings are fixed faster. Crucially, this will allow residents to be and feel safe in their homes. Government has already committed £5.1 billion of taxpayers' money to the cost of remediation. We want to protect leaseholders and residents from further costs that are not of their making. The Building Safety Levy is an essential step in achieving this. The purpose of the levy is to fund the government's building safety remediation programme. We estimate we need to raise around £3.4 billion over 10 years. The draft regulations laid before this House enable the levy to be imposed. The levy will be charged on certain building control applications for new residential floor space in England. Subject to the approval of the House, it will start being charged from the 1st of October 2026. Local authorities will collect the levy on behalf of central government. They are well placed to carry out this role as custodians of local building control with tax collection expertise, and I thank local authorities for the vital role they will play and for the steps they are already taking to prepare. My officials are supporting local authorities to ensure they are ready for the levy launch. We will provide collecting authorities with grant funding for set-up costs. All ongoing costs will be recoverable from the levy revenue received. The levy provides essential funding to deliver a safe built environment that meets residents' needs. It complements our broader housing goals, including the delivery of 1.5 million high-quality homes over this Parliament. The levy is designed to minimise detrimental impact on housing supply while securing the required revenue. To achieve this, there are different levy rates for each local authority which reflect local house prices. This protects viability in areas where house prices are lower. The differential rates are set out in the instrument. Development on previously developed land will benefit from a 50% discount rate. This discount compensates for the often higher cost of developing this type of land, ensuring that more sites remain viable. The Government is committed to getting Britain building again. Small and medium-sized builders play a crucial role in driving up house building rates, but they face significant challenges in recent years. In fact, just before I came here, I had a meeting with a whole round table of SME builders, which was very interesting. So I know the challenges very immediately that they're facing. We're therefore helping SME developers by exempting developments of fewer than 10 dwellings from the levy charge. Earlier this year, we announced the biggest boost to social and affordable housing investment in a generation. The building of more good quality, affordable housing must be accelerated. With this in mind, all affordable housing is exempt from the levy charge. However, we've gone further, and any housing built by a non-profit registered provider of social housing is also exempt. Profits from sales of such homes are often reinvested into the provision of further much-needed affordable housing. In addition, supported housing and other types of important community facilities, such as hospices and care homes, are also exempt from the charge. We will keep the rates and processes under review and will report at least every 3 years. With that, I move this statutory instrument.
Question is, and committee do consider this instrument.
My Lords, I'm very grateful to the noble lady for her explanation of this very substantial SI, and although the formula on page 15 may have deterred the casual reader, I found the explanatory memorandum at the end actually a very helpful summary of what is proposed. I welcome the measure as it's a key part of the package proposed by the previous government to fund remediation costs after the Grenfell tragedy. And while there is an element of rough justice here, in that developers who weren't even around at the time of the Grenfell tragedy will have to pay. But the alternative of the remediation costs, in those cases where the developer wasn't remediating the building, falling entirely on either the taxpayer and or the leaseholder, was even less palatable. The SI originates, as the Minister said, from the Building Safety Act 2022, and at first sight a delay of 4 years before it's introduced and a further delay before any money is paid is difficult to justify given the urgent need to make progress with remediation. But I think this doesn't matter, and perhaps the Minister can confirm this. While the taxpayer contribution is capped at 5.1 billion, I understand the Treasury is prepared to lend the Department additional funds should that cap be reached, and then recoup it from future levies. And as there's no sunset clause, the levy will remain in place until the Treasury is back in funds. My Lords, I have two main concerns about the regime for building safety: the speed at which it is happening and the exemptions from the Building Safety Act. I made these criticisms of the previous government, as noble lords who were there may recall, tabling amendments unsuccessfully to a variety of bills, so there is nothing partisan about my remarks. Firstly, speed. The Department published its remediation portfolio dashboard showing the position as at the end of August this year. Of the 5,554 buildings covered by the Act, and buildings are still being uncovered, 35% had had their work completed and 14% had work underway. Now that means that over 8 years after Grenfell, work has not actually started on over half the buildings at risk. Now the dashboard doesn't label this as work not started. Instead, there is a Whitehall euphemism which describes it as in the programme. So the next time my wife asks me why I haven't unloaded the dishwasher, I will say it's in the programme. But seriously, this means that thousands of people are still trapped in unsellable homes with unsafe cladding and fire safety defects, and often high service charges and high insurance.
Sorry, my Lord, if I could just interrupt the noble lord. We are about to divide. The bell will ring in a moment, so this would be an appropriate moment to adjourn the committee for 10 minutes.
My Lords, I was explaining that after the publication of the remediation portfolio dashboard, it showed that thousands of people are still trapped in unsellable homes with unsafe cladding and fire safety defects, and often high service charges and insurance. And that's why, writing in the British Safety Council magazine in July, the organisation End Our Cladding Scandal said, I quote, "But on the ground, in the eyes of residents and leaseholders who remain trapped, nothing has changed." And they went on to say, and I quote, "Labour is failing to deliver on its manifesto commitments on building safety." Their words, not mine. Now, the government have a target to complete remediation by 2029 for high-rise and 2031 for 11 to 18 metre buildings, 14 years after the tragedy. Surely, my Lords, we can do better than that. The government's initiative is called the Remediation Acceleration Plan. So might we have some acceleration? My second point concerns exemptions. The original proposition was that leaseholders, who bear no responsibility at all for what has gone wrong, should not have to bear the costs of putting things right. But that principle has been eroded. Some buildings don't qualify, some leaseholders don't qualify, and some defects don't qualify. For example, buildings under 11 metres do not qualify, even if they have the same cladding as the Grenfell Tower. The previous government argued that in those cases there was no threat to life, as people could escape. But that left the leaseholders in a difficulty. In one case, Aviva insisted on cladding removal within 4 months as a condition of insurance cover, with no one else prepared to quote. Leaseholders had to pay £45,000 each. And there are many other examples, such as insurers wanting combustible balconies replaced, or people unable to sell because their lender insisted on an EWS certificate which couldn't be provided. My Lords, those leaseholders have no protection. Now, the latest RAP, Remediation Acceleration Plan, announces, and I quote, the government's intention to provide funding in those exceptional cases where multi-occupied residential buildings under 11 metres have life-critical fire safety risks from cladding and do not have an alternative route to funding, end of quote. But what the insurers and lenders insist on is often not life-critical, but the property is unsellable or uninsurable without the work, so the leaseholders have to pay to put the defects right. Then there is a separate category of non-qualifying leaseholders, people who invested their life savings in a small number of buy-to-lets. Where the block is not being remediated by the developer, but by the Building Safety Fund, they are exposed to the full costs of non-cladding remedial work, often a high five-figure sum. Now, as this work is carried out at the same time as the cladding, this can hold up remediation for everyone, as the freeholder won't have the cash to pay if the non-qualifying leaseholders can't pay and can't sell. In Wales, there are no non-qualifying leaseholders. Those leaseholders are no more responsible for the defects than any other leaseholder. It is a distinction that should be removed, not least to accelerate progress with remediation. And then some defects are not covered. The Remediation Acceleration Plan 2025 only refers to unsafe cladding, often leaving leaseholders exposed to other costs. Again, that is a distinction that should not be there. The leaseholders have no more responsibility for the non-cladding defects than the cladding defects. And those leaseholders who enfranchised, encouraged by successive governments, are now in a worse position than those leaseholders who didn't enfranchise, another inequity. My Lords, I make two final points. The government said in its manifesto, we will put a renewed focus on ensuring those responsible for the building safety crisis pay to put it right. This SI is about the developers. But what about the construction materials industry, found by the Grenfell inquiry to have been guilty of systematic dishonesty, making false claims, and from whom not a penny has been paid? 8 years after Grenfell, the latest update tells us that the government is, I quote, consulting on robust sanctions, penalties, and liabilities for manufacturers. Again, progress has been far too slow. Finally, we know that the government plans to legislate to address some of the problems I've been outlining. On the 6th of October, the Secretary of State wrote to End Our Cladding, I quote, this will include a new bill in Parliament to ensure that delinquent buildings get fixed, close inverted commas. I understand the bill will have a hard end date for remediation with criminal prosecution if it's not done. But this implies that delinquent buildings won't get fixed until we have the bill, implying yet further delay. We're told it will be introduced when parliamentary time allows, but that sits uneasily with the government's commitment to move things at a faster pace. So I asked the Minister whether she does understand the frustration of those who through no fault of their own, face hardship and risks. And what can she do to reassure them that the government will address with renewed urgency the problems that confront them?
My Lords, I declare my interest as a freeholder of a mixed-use building, 15 metres tall, constructed in 2018 post-Grenfell in Norwich. Now, addressing the consequences of the use of aluminiumised composite materials in pre-Grenfell tall buildings is the priority that the Building Safety Act is meant to resolve, and a commitment that should remain undimmed. But unlike my noble friend, Lord Young, I want to constrain my comments to the effect of the proposed regulations that is contemplated to be introduced from the 1st of October on the construction of new homes, not the existing homes. And that doesn't mean I don't care about the existing homes, but I think we need to view part of this legislation, these regulations, through the lens of the construction industry. Now, it's common ground we need more homes. Not only is it to be driven by the UK population, which the ONS tells us is only just now shy of 70 million, but also because you can't sell capitalism to people who can't accumulate capital. And the best way of doing that for most families is to do by building a stake in your own home. So nothing we should do should discourage or disincentivise the need to build the homes our nation needs. Now, there are enough headwinds in construction already, and the noble lady, the Minister, probably has some of those ringing in her ears from her lunchtime meeting with SME builders. And there are more headwinds to come. And the BSA levy is potentially one of those headwinds which could chill construction still further at a very delicate fiscal moment. And that's important because if there's no building, there's no levy, and there's no money to fix the cladding. Now, we know there's a crisis of confidence in London's building industry, and I'm going to focus on London just for the moment, because a lack of housing starts in London is going to imperil the government's nationwide house building ambitions. All historic sources on housing starts to point to London being in crisis. The Molineux data shows that just 2,000 private homes started in the first half of the year, a record low. MHCLG data showed that the total homes started in the entirety of the 12 months to quarter 1 2025 is 60% lower than the previous record low, set in 1990. And the GLA's affordable data shows that only 347 homes started in Q1, a record low following lows in 24-25. Brought right up to date, the interim statistics show that in the last quarter for London, new starts were 40% lower than the previous low point, with nothing over 18 metres started anywhere. My lords, developers in London are on strike. But if we can't sort out building in London, then we'll never get roofs over people's heads nationally. Now, this isn't just about the levy holding things back. House prices have risen in the capital by 1% since 2015, a previous high point. But Berkeley Homes tells me that build costs have risen by over 40% in the same period, directionally half on materials and half on regulatory burdens. So we know that viability is under threat. Now, but if there's a consent, because planning has previously been fingered as the hold-up for development, but if you now get your planning consent, you now need to get a building safety regulator approval before you start digging foundations for all those dwelling homes that are excluded from the levy. Now, so it's the building safety regulator that is putting speed bumps in the way. Now, these regulations provide for applications to be made to the regulator before the 1st of October next year, or the levy will apply. And that sounds like a long way away. But, my lords, I'm told that it's currently taking 44 weeks, at best, for the regulator to apply to an application. More often than not, that replies in the negative. I've heard of a refusal from the regulator that was evidenced by a single word: roof. And that's just not good enough. It's already too late to apply and hope for approval with just 50 weeks to go to the 1st of October. And that's not helping either many of the thousands of already completed homes in London doing nothing but eating their heads off in interest for want of a final approval. So I've done some research, and I've learned that the reasons for all this relate to the staffing and transition hasn't really been sorted out between HSE and the Building Safety Regulator. There's far too much subjective interpretation between professionals, each of whom may be correct, just in their difference of preference, but either of which could be safely implemented. The regulator's IT system is incompatible with the software that all developers use, in particular because it doesn't use the indexes. And that's important, because rather than online click on the screen and be transported instantly to one of the thousands of A0 plans through the index, the regulator's IT system, I am told, means you've got to search manually through all 1,000 sheets yourself. It's hardly surprising it's taking so long. And then, of course, we've got the numbers. An additional £60 to £70, up to £90 in Fulham per square metre in London, and direction £25 to £35 elsewhere. Now, I have consulted with developers. More than ever, time is money, and reluctantly they are prepared to accept the levy. So that's good news. So there's an alignment on the need and the willingness to pay. But their view, and I can agree with this, and I'm going to ask the Minister whether she can agree with this, that before the levy comes into play, The regulator needs to sort out the relationship between the Building Safety Regulator and the HSE. The software needs to be made compatible with BIM, so we actually get some productivity. We've got to agree the objective accepted standards between what is an acceptable way of building these new homes, rather than be subject to arbitrary preference. And there needs to be a response within 4 weeks, not 44 weeks. Now, if the builders are making that proposal, I think that's a fair bargain. And I think the government should accept it, because unless they do, the developers' strike will continue. And then no levy will be created at all. And that doesn't help anybody, still less the people for my noble friend Lord Young is most concerned. So, and I think it is important that we think also about the cash flow. And I've looked carefully at the regulations and the implementation. I am concerned that, particularly in a large-scale flattered development, should one go ahead, then the entirety of the levy, and remember it's £90 a square metre in Fulham, would be paid on the entire development at the point at which the very first part of that development had a completion certificate. So just at the point at which the developer is suffering greatest cash stress, the entire bill would be due. And I'm concerned for the cash flow viability of these organisations, noting that the Financial Times has reported that in the entirety of London, a city of 10 million people, in the last quarter, less than 24 new flats have been sold. And that's a real crisis point. So, will the Minister recognise that until the system is working smoothly, nobody will start anything over 18 metres, unless we can get the workability, the timescales and the IT right, the strike will continue. Will the Minister give a commitment that at the point at which the levy is introduced, approval times can be down to, say, a reasonable 4 weeks, because time is money and money is risk. And on that basis, I think there'll be a grudging acceptance, but an acceptance nonetheless by the industry, that we can move forward, and then the people for whom my noble friend Lord Young is most concerned can be remediated more quickly. Because unless we get an accommodation between a government and the development industry on the positive going forward, they won't be sorted out, and the government will stand zero chance of meeting its ambitious housing targets, which I think we should all endorse.
To listen to the noble Lord Fuller, and I want to note his concerns, and I hope the Minister will respond to those. But this is such a fundamental issue that I think it's important that I state that we support the substance of the levy as set out. And indeed, I notice the noble Lord Fuller actually said that there is a general acceptance by the industry, despite some of the problems that the Minister will need to address. I want to say that I support, I think entirely, every point made by the noble Lord Young of Cookham and the conclusions that he has reached. I want to share his concerns about the speed of action. It has been too slow, and that the fact that for many leaseholders, nothing in practice has changed. And there are deadlines of 2029 and 2031, as we've heard, and they are, my lords, not far off. However, I hope the Minister will be able to confirm the statement of noble Lord Young of Cookham that the Treasury may be willing to increase the level of loans to the department, and I do very much hope that that will prove to be the case. But also, I've got two very specific questions I want to ask the Minister before I say a few further words. I have not understood from the explanatory note, a memorandum, why it is that there's a 3-year review period as opposed to a shorter one. And in the context of what the noble Lord Young of Cookham said about speed, I do think, and indeed what the noble Lord Fuller has said, that actually reviewing after 3 years seems to me to be too long a period. But secondly, I'd just like to ask the Minister why the purpose-built student accommodation has a threshold of 30 bed spaces for exemptions, as opposed to some other number. Why was the figure of 30 decided upon? Well, my lords, these are vitally important regulations as they implement one of the cornerstones of the Building Safety Act that was the response to the Grenfell Tower tragedy. And as we know, the purpose of the levy is to provide funding for remediation that is essential in many residential properties in order to assure the safety of residents. And this statutory instrument provides the considerable detail needed, including the exemptions, for example, for small developments and for social housing, which seem to us to be reasonable. And it seems too to be right to base the levy on a per square metre, per metre squared of floor space. It seems to be right that brownfield sites will have a levy at a lower rate, and that the levy also varies according to general property values in a local authority area. So I think the government has broadly got this approach right. The problem, however, as the noble Lord Young of Cookham so rightly identified, is that many leaseholders are still being penalised by freeholders and managing agents where properties have not yet been remediated. The penalties imposed are via the substantial increases in service charges, and on top of this, innocent leaseholders are paying huge household insurance costs. So I would ask the Minister whether the government will review its approach to defining those buildings at risk, because these are not the same as the assessment made by the insurance market. And it is leaseholders who then pay the price, as well as finding the value of their property has plummeted in value. So I just want to, in conclusion, ask the Minister whether the government will commit to a review of at-risk properties and the external walls system assessment to provide some hope for leaseholders caught up in a nightmare not of their making.
First of all, can I declare my interest as a councillor in central Bedfordshire? Fortunately, we don't have many high-rise buildings in rural areas. Just to respond to these Building Safety Regulations 2025, I mean, it's absolutely right. The principle that those who have profited from residential development should contribute to the cost of making homes safe is both fair and necessary. This levy was set up in the Building Safety Act 2022 under the previous Conservative administration, and it's an important part of the wider efforts. And I make very clear that we support this, but there are some issues that I do think need addressing. The government anticipates that the levy will raise approximately £3.4 billion over the next decade to help fund remediation of historic safety defects, including dangerous cladding. You know, for too long, thousands of residents have lived in buildings that they know are unsafe, suffering the stress and emotional toil of being in an unsafe building, and as my noble friend Lord Young of Cookham pointed out, unable to sell and unable to move on with their lives. And it was not of their making. I think it's absolutely crucial, and the number of points that my noble friend made, this needs to be done faster and it needs to be done better. And I would very much like to know from the Minister whether she believes that the two deadlines of 2029 and 2031 will be achieved, given, as my noble friend pointed out, something around half have not even started. I can't remember the exact phrase that you... In plan, I think, was the phrase. In programme. Well, we need in action rather than in programme. So we welcome the levy. It's been designed with care, and certain exemptions are in place, particularly for smaller developers, social housing providers and community-focused schemes. Those exemptions are vital, and they ensure that the supply of affordable and socially beneficial housing is not inadvertently undermined. Now, the Secondary Legislation Committee's findings that the overall impact on house prices and supply is expected to be modest, and that the administrative costs are proportionate to the revenues raised, But I do want to come on to some of the issues that were raised by my noble friend Lord Fuller, because I think there's two aspects to this. One is the safety, and it's absolutely crucial, of the people who are in unsafe buildings. But the second one is that we need to ensure that we are still building buildings for people who do not have a place to live. Now, the concerns raised by the National Builders Federations and others about the cumulative impact of regulatory pressure on house building should not be dismissed out of hand. And where these have greatest impact is on London. Now, Molly, I know my noble friend gave a number of statistics, but Molly analysis did suggest that there will only be 15 to 20,000 homes being under construction in London in January 2027 on current analysis. That's compared to a target of 82,000, which was a reduced target. Now, there are 185,000 living in temporary accommodation in London and over 350,000 in the UK. We need homes, and we need to ensure that whatever we do helps deliver new homes in a safe and meaningful way. And we need to ensure that there isn't a cumulative impact of this. And the second part of that is really important, is the resourcing and performance of the Building Safety Regulator. Since July 2024, over 2,000 applications have been submitted for building control at gateways 2 and 3, of which 283 have been approved, 670 have either been declared invalid or rejected, and 997 are still awaiting approval. Those are delays to buildings. And in fact, Building Magazine estimated that 1 in 4 that hit stage 4, which is the final approval, are not yet approved. That is hundreds of empty apartments that could be occupied by people. Therefore, I am seeking assurance from the Minister what will be done to speed up the Building Safety Regulator, and also, as again my noble friend Lord Fuller made, the process is actually somewhat complex, making it more transparent and more accessible so we can get stuff done quicker. Delays or bottlenecks at this stage are slowing down vital safety work and much needed development alike. And as my noble friend Lord Fuller raised, the cash flow impact means that schemes become increasingly unviable. And I am seeing developers saying, we're not starting with this, not because we're not willing to build safe buildings, but because of the financial risks of unforeseen and unnecessary delays of trying to get through the Building Safety Regulation scheme, and that banks are charging increased interest rates because of that risk to developers. So getting this right is a win-win. We have more safe buildings and we get more homes for people. So we need to take that into account. Now, I would like to just take a moment to reflect on the wider context. The Grenfell Tower fire was more than 8 years ago, and it continues to cast a long shadow. Its profound systematic failings in regulation, in oversight, and in the way residents' voices were ignored. Now, progress has been made since that tragedy, but we must continue to push forward with urgency and determination. The promises made to affected communities must be honoured in full, and the culture that allowed such failures to occur must be permanently changed. In that spirit, we support the introduction of this levy. We believe it's a proportionate and necessary measure, and will continue to hold the government to account for how it is implemented. Can I thank the Minister for bringing forward these regulations and commend the work of all those across both houses on this work, across all parties who have contributed to this important legislation.
My Lords, I'm grateful for those very helpful contributions to this debate and for the broad support that the regulations have received from all of the noble Lords who have spoken. I would say that I do completely understand the stress and emotional upset that these issues have caused to all those affected by them, not least of which because I have a building in Stevenage called Vista Tower, which was profoundly affected by the issues. It wasn't a cladding issue for them, it was a different issue. But I dealt with that, I've dealt with that over the years since these issues were discovered. And I would agree with the Noble Lord Jamieson that for those affected by the Grenfell Tower disaster, it's been a very long time indeed, and we need to move things on as quickly as we can, not just for all those who are still suffering from the impact of the building safety issues, but for those people as well at Grenfell who have very bravely and courageously, in my view, used the awful experience that they went through to champion the cause of others who have been affected. And I hope we can accelerate this plan very quickly so that we can get through these issues as quickly as possible. And indeed, as all noble lords have recognised, this building safety levy is part of the mechanism to help us do that. I will pick up some of the individual points that noble peers have made. If I miss any, I will, I'm sure you'll either stand up and ask me again, or I'll reply in writing. The noble Lord Young referred to Treasury support and the ongoing funding support for this. Remediation funding is already being provided, and the levy launch date doesn't affect the pace of remediation, so we're not going to slow it down and wait for the levy to kick in. The government's committed to remediating buildings as quickly as possible, so levy receipts will cover the remaining remediation costs once taxpayer contribution, industry pledges and contractual obligations have been taken into account. So it's our intention to keep going with an accelerating plan, not wait till the levy comes in to carry on with this work. The noble Lord Young referred to the scope of the levy. The scope of the levy doesn't imply responsibility on behalf of levy payers for historic building safety defects. I think noble Lord Young was broadly supportive of putting this levy across the board. Developers have got to make a full contribution to the overall cost of making buildings safe, reflecting the wider benefit that they derive from a well-functioning market and the substantial funding support the government continues to provide to the housing market. So it is being applied across the board. On the remediation acceleration plan, and the noble Lord Young mentioned this, but it was mentioned by other peers as well, it's clearly 8 years on from Grenfell. It's no justification for any building to remain unsafe, and our goal is clear: to remove the barriers to remediation, to get the buildings fixed faster and allow residents to at last feel safe in their own homes. An update on the remediation acceleration plan was published in July and outlined our plan to bring forward a remediation bill to create a hard endpoint for remediation. A proposed legal duty to remediate will compel landlords to remediate buildings within fixed timescales or face criminal prosecution. The RAP set timescales to provide greater clarity to residents on when they might expect their buildings to be remediated. And as noble lords have recognised, we do expect buildings by the end of 2029 at every building over 18 metres in a government funding scheme will be remediated, and every building above 11 metres with unsafe cladding will have either been remediated or have a date for completion, or its landlords will be liable for penalties. I'm afraid I'm not able to comment on the exact date of the remediation bill. I'd love to do that, but it will be brought forward as soon as parliamentary time allows. And I do very much understand the frustration of those in unsafe buildings still waiting for work to be done, but we are moving at pace on this now. And I know that the noble Lord Young held his own government's feet to the fire on this, as well as pressing me on it, and I think he's right to do that.
The comment that you just made there, you said all those over 18 metres will be done by 2029. Mm-hmm. All those in the second category by 2031 will either be done or have a completion date.
Yes.
Completion date could be 1-2 years.
It will be expected to be a reasonable date. I mean, we're not going to let people push it forward another 10 years, for example. That would be unreasonable. And I did note the comments about the insurance industry, and we continue to work with the insurance industry on this. It's a difficult issue, and I understand that. We will continue to work with the industry on that issue. The noble Lord Young asked about non-qualifying leaseholders, and I know this has been a very sore point with those non-qualifying leaseholders. The leaseholder protections were designed to protect people living in their own homes, and that's why the threshold was set at ownership of 3 properties in total, to distinguish between owner-occupiers from those who have made investment decisions. However, there is still substantial support, all leaseholders benefit where a responsible developer has been identified or where the freeholder is or was associated with the developer, and all leaseholders benefit from protections in relevant buildings if it is their principal home. Where no responsible developer can be identified or made to pay, the Cladding Safety Scheme funds eligible cladding remediation for buildings over 11 metres, ensuring leaseholders do not face cladding bills. The law also allows recovery of costs for interim measures and expert reports via remediation contribution orders, placing costs with those responsible rather than residents. Even if some leases are non-qualifying, for example investment properties, a leaseholder's principal home on the 14th of February 2022 in a relevant building can still be a qualifying lease and benefit from protections if it meets the statutory criteria. In relation to the issues around construction product manufacturers, the powers to charge the levy in the Building Act 1984 don't allow for it to be charged on construction product manufacturers. In February 2025, the government published the Construction Products Green Paper, setting out comprehensive proposals for system-wide reform of that construction products regime. We're reviewing consultation responses, including on measures to introduce sufficiently robust sanctions, penalties and liabilities to hold economic operators, including construction product manufacturers, to account. And the government's committed to ensuring effective redress for manufacturer failings, whether historical or arising in the future. The cost of remediation must be shared equitably among those who have profited from or have an interest in the development and construction of unsafe buildings. It's unacceptable that some construction product manufacturers have not yet made a fair contribution to resolving this building safety crisis, and I want to be very categorical about that. The Building Safety Act introduced new provisions in sections 147 and 151 to enable developers, building owners and leaseholders to bring a claim against construction product manufacturers and suppliers where a product has been missold or is inherently defective. And section 149 allows claims for historical defects where cladding products have rendered a building unfit for habitation. And these provisions create redress routes where no direct contractual relationship exists. Developers sit at the apex of the industry and are therefore well positioned to take the lead in funding and coordinating remediation works. And once they're complete, developers can then seek to recover costs from those other parties involved in the supply chain. We're currently reviewing those sections of the Building Safety Act to make sure the redress routes are robust, support effective cost recovery and promote accountability, and we'll provide an update on that later this year. On the protection on buildings that are over 11 metres or 5 stories, evidence shows, and I think we've had this discussion before, that problems with historical fire safety defects are concentrated in medium and high-rise buildings where the risk to life tends to increase with height. By contrast, buildings under 11 metres typically present lower risks and can often be managed with other proportionate mitigations rather than remediation schemes. Now, I know that there's a dispute with the insurance industry over that, and as I said, we continue our dialogue with them. Leaseholders in collectively owned buildings are excluded from the leaseholder protections because the freehold is owned by some or all of the leaseholders, and the protections would not therefore have their intended effect. Collectively owned buildings are still eligible for the government's Cladding Safety Scheme and the Responsible Actors Scheme, and they can also bring remediation contribution orders against former owners, developers or associated persons, and we're committed to reviewing how better to protect leaseholders from costs. The Noble Lord Fuller and the Noble Lord Jamieson raised the cost at the pace of house building and the impact of that, and the levy has been designed to minimise potential housing supply impacts, while balancing the need to raise revenue required to make homes safe. And I have to say, all of the issues raised with me by the SME roundtable I attended earlier this afternoon are already being explored and looked at, and I will continue that dialogue with them. I've undertaken to give them some feedback. Developers have had plenty of notice that the levy is coming and to include it in their viability plans. It was announced in 21, and developers have had 15 months from being provided with the detailed design until the launch in 2026. Levy measures to minimise the housing supply impact include, and I've already mentioned these in my introduction, variable levy rates at local authority level, the discount on developments on previously developed land, exemptions for affordable housing and developments of fewer than 10 dwellings. and we expect the cost of the levy will in time be reflected in the price that developers pay for land. Affordable housing is exempt from the building safety levy, and the government is unlocking house building at an unprecedented level. We've already taken urgent action through the planning reforms, which we'll be discussing next week, and through the £39 billion of investment for social and affordable housing. I do want to make some comments on the building safety regulator, because I think that's really important, and noble lords have mentioned it. So local authorities will administer the levy even when the building safety regulator is the building control authority, and the levy has been designed to minimise additional responsibilities imposed on the BSR. On the 30th of June, we announced a new phase for the BSR, including strengthening the leadership of that organisation, tackling operational challenges and moving it from the HSE to a standalone body. The Building Safety Regulator has been open and transparent about the challenges of implementing a significant shift in the way building safety is now regulated in high-risk buildings. The BSR has implemented a range of operational improvements, and they're going to recruit over 100 new staff to strengthen the capacity by the end of the year. Over the past 3 months, the BSR has made major changes to improve the processing of Gateway 2 applications, including a new fast-track innovation unit. Early indications suggest the new model is working effectively. We expect the model to start to deliver improvements in processing times in the coming months, and we're continuing to commit to the highest standards of safety. The fast-track process is about refining a new system, not stepping back on commitments. I do take the noble lord's point about the quality of responses. It's clearly not acceptable to just send a response back with roof written on it. I will take that back. And his points about digital compatibility are well made. I'll take that back and reply to him in writing on that. On the point about the payment point, I understand the levy is paid at building control applications, so in a major development that would probably be phased, and so the building levy would be applied in that phased way. He asked for a delay to the introduction, but developers have already had 15 months from being provided with the details, so I don't think that would be justified. And on the SME point, we are still consulting on the issue around medium-sized developments, and I will respond in due course once we've analysed those responses. The Noble Lord Shipley asked about reviews. They can be more frequent. It's a minimum 3 years. There will be a continual review process. And we need to balance providing certainty with ability to amend in the light of changing circumstances, but we will continually keep this under review. And in response to his question about PBSA, 30 bed spaces in PBSA is a rough equivalent for 10 dwelling house threshold, so that's why it's been set at that rate. So, in conclusion, we think the building safety levy is essential to fund the remediation of these historic building safety issues without further burdening residents and leaseholders who have already suffered quite considerably through all this. The government is committed to delivering 1.5 million homes to meet the country's long-term housing needs and unlock growth, and that must work in parallel with our commitment to remedying building safety failures of the past. The industry that contributed to such problems must pay to remedy them. The draft regulations set out a fair approach to collect the required funds while ensuring minimal impact on the housing supply and industry. I beg to move.
Comments about the improvements in the speed and transparency of the building safety regulator, and that's very good. Is there some kind of timetable of targets for how quickly it will get to a stage where it is turning around stage 2, Gateway 2, Gateway 3 and Gateway 4 within a particular timetable? And if so, not expecting an answer now, would the Minister be kind enough to write to us on that?
I thank the Noble Lord for his comments. We have a new person in charge of the building safety regulator, which is Andy Rowe. I think it probably would be helpful for me to ask Andy to draft a letter for Noble Lords to say where we are with the progress on making the BSR more effective.
The question is that the Grand Committee has considered this instrument. As many as of that opinion will say content. The contrary, not content. The contents have it. So we'll just pause for a moment for a change of personnel.